So Bernie Sanders, Ed Markey, and Kamala Harris are teaming up to fight for the monthly Economic Crisis Support Act, a bill which would provide $2,000 a month for individuals making under $120,000 until 3 months after this crisis is over. And guys, this is actually a pretty good bill. You might hear this and think, oh my gosh, Kamala Harris is on board. But actually, I've looked through the information I can find about it, and this is actually a pretty good bill. Now, from the get-go at the beginning, and still even now, Bernie Sanders is in favor of a universal basic income program of $2,000 a month for the duration of this crisis. And so, there wouldn't be that $120,000 cap. But this bill, which Bernie Sanders is, putting his name on and is fighting for, does have that $120,000 a year cap. Now, that does still cover the vast majority of Americans. I think over 90%, about 91% of Americans would be covered under this bill. So it's pretty good. And there's also robust protections for children. But let's take a look at some of the more information on this bill. And actually, this video on this here is actually pretty sad. It's talking about how individuals who are waiting for their CARES Act check are like literally on, like it's a life or death matter. And one of the issues that we've seen with this CARES Act is that it's taking a really, really, really long time to get to a lot of people. And so this bill actually does have a lot of provisions in it to make sure that the checks are going to get out routinely, and it will kick in much faster if the bill is passed. So let's take a look at some of the information on the check. So on this bill. So you can see here, as I was mentioning, individuals with income under $120,000, we got $2,000 monthly throughout the duration of this crisis, however long it is, and for 3 months following the pandemic. Married couples who file jointly will get $4,000, and as I was saying, when it comes to children, $2,000 for per children, up to 3 children. So, it's pretty good, and it's pretty thorough. Now, other important things to note about this bill is that it does prohibit, explicitly in the bill, it prohibits debt collectors and banks from snatching the checks directly from you, and also includes provisions for the homeless, something that was very spotty when it came to the CARES Act. It also pays people regardless of whether or not they've filed for their tax return in this cycle. Now, the thing that I do want to quickly talk about here is when it comes to prohibiting the debt collectors and prohibiting the banks from snatching the checks, that's actually really, really important and really, really good to be included specifically in the bill. Because one of the things which we saw from the CARES Act is that there were banks who were snatching the checks. And actually, this is something that I mentioned at the time that I was really upset about, which is that in the bill, it had language, in the CARES Act bill, it had language which would allow basically the Treasury to write in rules prohibiting debt collectors from snatching the checks, but they refused to actually write in the rules. And this was, the Democrats thinking that they were being, master brilliant legislators, because what it did is it set up a kind of in their minds, a kind of catch-22 for Republicans, where they would end up being forced to write in those kinds of regulations, they thought, and if they didn't write in the regulations, then the Republicans would be the ones who would be blamed if the checks got stolen from individuals. So basically, Democrats, Nancy Pelosi, and Elizabeth Warren explicitly thought they were being brilliant master legislators by allowing individuals to, have their checks snatched up by big banks. So that was something that, when I talked about the CARES Act, I was not happy about, because the moment that the bill was passed, immediately Elizabeth Warren and a bunch of state attorney generals jumped on writing letters to the Treasury, basically arguing that these should be specific, that, rules should be explicitly written into the guidelines of how the bill was going to be executed, as opposed to just writing it into the bill from the beginning. That's something that just really pisses me off when it comes to legislating, because they think they can be brilliant brilliant maneuvering by doing stuff like that. So, but that's just something that annoys me, and I'm really glad to see it being explicitly written into this bill that no, you cannot snatch this away from individuals. So that's really, really, really important when it comes to this thing. Now, the other thing that we've got to talk about when it comes to this is VP choice, because obviously part of the reason why Kamala Harris wants to be on this bill is because of the VP choice. It makes her a much more valuable, or I guess valuable, kind of VP pick for Joe Biden, because one of the things that we've seen when it comes to the VP sort of nominating stuff is that Joe Biden is torn. We've seen multiple articles talking about how Joe Biden is supposedly torn between whether or not he wants to pick a progressive and whether or not he wants to pick a woman of color. Now, of course, you could do both if you pick someone like Nina Turner, or there's a couple of other really good options when it comes to that. But the main two, sort of women of color who are in for consideration when it comes to this are Kamala Harris and Stacey Abrams, neither of which have the same kind of progressive credentials that at least a lot of progressives would want. And then the more progressive candidates, now you might disagree whether or not these candidates are progressives, but Joe Biden's camp considers, someone like Katie Porter and Elizabeth Warren. Those are the two main progressive choices that the Joe Biden camp is looking at. Now, again, you might disagree with whether or not those people are progressives, but that's how the Joe Biden camp is looking at this. And we've seen also other reporting that Bernie Sanders is not really supporting or pushing for Elizabeth Warren to be VP. Could that be, related to some of the stuff that happened in the primary? I don't know. It's possible. It's very likely. But he's not pushing for Elizabeth Warren to be the VP pick. So, basically what I'm saying is Kamala Harris has an opportunity then to try to attach her name to Bernie Sanders and be able to sort of do both, right? Like be the sort of progressive pick and also be, the woman of color pick, and greatly increase the odds that she's picked as VP. And so this is a great opportunity for her strategically. And Bernie Sanders is like, well, hey, look, if this can, increase the likelihood to get checks out and help individuals, whatever, you can put your name on a bill with me. That's perfectly fine. Honestly, having a name like Kamala Harris does make it much, much more likely that this kind of bill might actually get some, more establishment picks and things like that, and maybe even might actually, come to a vote or at least be included in the Democratic Party's Democratic leadership consideration when it comes to the next stages of bailout. So I'm definitely more optimistic about this bill than some of the stuff that we were seeing earlier. If AOC and Ilhan Omar can, AOC, Ilhan Omar, and some of the more progressives in the House can come along with a similar version of this bill in the House, I think that we'll also start to see, things come together much better. So that's another thing to talk about. The other thing is when it comes to Ed Markey, guys, so he's, as you know, being challenged right now by Joe Kennedy. Obviously, he's a Kennedy, so the polls aren't looking particularly good for Ed Markey. But guys, Ed Markey's pretty good, right? Like, he's definitely one of the better ones in the Senate. We definitely want to keep him. And compared to Joe Kennedy, I just want to read you this tweet. I mean, this was like onion level self-parody. That was the tweet that I put out about this. But not a single patient should be forced to fight off medical bankruptcy in the midst of a global health pandemic without a lawyer by their side. So if you have a lawyer by your side, it's okay. Now look, I want to be clear. Do I want individuals to have lawyers helping them out, fighting for them when it comes to this stuff? Yeah, of course. But notice what this does, right? It's basically saying, oh, well, it's perfectly okay for people to, have to deal with medical bankruptcy. But as long as you got a lawyer by your side, I mean, this is just like a typical, like very kind of like neoliberal sort of thing to say that, like, as long as the system, as long as you've got competing people fighting for you on your side, in a particular system, it's okay. Now, technically, Joe Kennedy does support Medicare for all, but he's also not against a lot of the moneyed interest, a lot of the moneyed power. So the question of whether or not he would be willing to actually fight the people he would need to fight in order to pass a Medicare for all bill is, very much so up in question. And another tweet that he put out, which just annoyed me: not a single American family should be forced to fight for their home against the big banks without a lawyer by your side. Just like, not quite. Yeah, some of the stuff that he puts out just like annoys me to no end. So go out and support Ed Markey. Like, send a few bucks his way if you're, so inclined and if you're able to. Because we got to keep this guy out. I mean, literally the only reason why he's polling so well is because he's a Kennedy. Because he has the name Kennedy, people are like, oh, I like him. Yeah, Joe Kennedy looks great. Sounds great. Okay, let's do it. No, we got to keep this guy out of office, or, well, keep him out of the Senate. I'm pretty sure he's in the House, so. But anyway, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this bill that's coming out. Hopefully, we can do what we can to support this, because this is really important. A lot of Americans are really, really struggling right now, and the CARES Act just wasn't sufficient. A one-time $1,200 check isn't nearly enough, and this is much better in terms of what needs to be done. Now, I've mentioned before, I think the best thing to do, of course, is just to basically have people stay on the payrolls and have the government basically be paying people's paycheck, because that also provides for another big concern, which is then people can know where they're going to be going back at the end of this thing. Because look, I mean, think about it, right? You lose your job, you don't know if you're going to be able to have a job when this thing is all over. Then, yeah, of course, you're antsy to ease the lockdowns. Yeah, of course, because you have that sort of emotional stress. Because look, if you have a time period where, yeah, you're bringing in less money, but you've got a job to go back to, that's a lot less bad as opposed to you don't know at all where you're going to be returning for work at the end of this thing, and you're just like, I need this thing to be over so that I can start figuring out how this thing is going to go. Because then what happens is you don't know like when the next time you're going to have a paycheck, right? You don't know when you're going to be able to get another job again if you lost your job and don't have any kind of assurances. And so there is a kind of concern there where even this bill doesn't do enough, in the sense that there's a lot of people out there who won't know where they're going to be able to go for their next job. But nonetheless, this bill here is a significant improvement on what we've got going on right now. So it's definitely something to support, definitely something to push for. So, but anyway, if you did like this video, I'd appreciate it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.